Welcome to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Hey, that's me. Hi, and welcome to Positive Talk. Our show features the best positive stories and people from around the globe as we endeavor to answer the universal question of why am I here and what is my purpose? Understanding that can change everything, and knowing your greatness is fundamental to living your best life. So join us right now as together we work to create the adventure of our lifetime. And welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Kevin McDonald, and you're listening to Positive Talk on the Brushwood Media Network. I'm so pleased that you're here. We've got a really good show for you today. We've got a gentleman that, if I read his entire bio and all the schooling he's done and the places he's worked and the things he's been a part of, it'd take the whole show. So I'm not going to do that because I want to talk to him about his book and about the concept that we don't often talk about here. We don't talk about really anywhere, which is the adoptive process, what it's like for a child who is adopted to grow up in that, with that attached to them, and the various aspects of that. And that happened to him. He's got a book out. The book is called The Lost Coin, and I suspect that the title has a lot to do with how he felt growing up in many ways. And so in any event, I'll just say this once. Dr. Stephen, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you, sir. Great to be here.
It's awesome to have you. And, this is a topic that kind of flies under the radar just a little bit, because we talked now, and I told you before we began that my mother-in-law was adopted, and it affected her entire life. And so it was a big deal for her. And I suspect that it's a big deal for a lot of folks that are adopted. Can you tell us your story and what caused you to write the book?
Yeah, I should probably say just to start that I live and work on Bainbridge Island. Have been for roughly the last 8 years. I'm a psychotherapist here on Bainbridge Island.
By the way,
Before that,
it's the most beautiful place in the world, but I don't want
Yeah.
you to know that because I don't want you to move there.
Right. Anyway, I wanted to point out, because it's important perspective I lend to my book. So tell me I just blew right by your question. It was sorry. You just wanted me to tell about the book or how I got started, or
Tell us your story, basically. What
okay.
Because I know that you
almost
go ahead.
almost two years ago to the day, I got belonged to 23andMe, which I think most people are familiar with. And I've been with them for years. I was one of the very first people who was a member. I got a notification, which I often used to get all the time, but this one, and they usually say you're second cousin, third cousin, which never amounted to anything. This was the first and only time I got one that said it was a first cousin notification. And after a little exchange back and forth, he's younger than I am. We certainly were not cousins, but as it turned out, and I was to learn within that hour that his mother was one of what I then learned was from her directly was my half sister, and then therefore she and her other half sisters, all four of them together, and me share the same birth father. They all grew up together. They had no idea that there was another me running around. It was clearly a secret. I knew enough about my birth father at the time to definitely cinch it in their minds that I was who I said I was. But beyond that, other than the fact that he'd been deceased for a while, I knew nothing of him, and other than what little I knew from the past. So that got the ball rolling. So we did a lot of exchanging of pictures and stories of family and so forth. But at that time, the light went off, and I think the book was already in me. And I sat down again to write 5 hours a day for 6 days a week until Labor Day, and I came up with a draft. And so I crafted that memoir. I'd been reading a lot of memoirs, so this was not foreign territory to me. But I wanted in part to chronicle both this lifelong search and quest, not only for the identity of my birth parents, but also the bigger question, which raises, I think, for a lot of people who are adopted, is who am I? And part of the book, I say the very center part of the book, the heart of the book itself is the conclusion of searching for my birth mother from the time I was, well, I became really curious when I was 13, and I was 40 when I found her. Finally, learned of her identity and where she lived, and that middle. We may talk more about this later. The actual moment of actually meeting her, and what that was like after all those years, and realizing, of course, she had always hoped I would show up, she had children too, and they always knew about me. So, but the book is something more than that. It's also that's why I mentioned about being a psychotherapist, because my story is is like other adoptees' stories in that we're all different from one each other. They're all different, and there's a different story for every person who's been adopted. Some are happy stories, some are really tragic, some are uncertain and complete, some are riddled with surprises. Those that's the kind of the diversity of, so to speak, of all that when you begin to try to characterize the stories of adoptees. But what I'm bringing to the book, I think, is that from a psychological point of view, is that this separation of birth mother, and child at an early age is a profoundly disrupting. Even though we're infants, we don't cognitively think of it that way, but we have that the unconscious, sort of the psyche, the soul, so to speak. There's what other writers have called a primal wound, and we carry that with us. And that way, it's a form of trauma. It changes our own development, our own sense of ourselves. Arguably, it alters the fate of our own lives. And in this way, we're way much more in common. I mentioned to you before we started here, I just did a speaking event with a partner back in Kansas City Library on my 75th birthday with a group of people who were all born where I was born in Kansas City. And when I mentioned this issue of the sense of searching, of wanting to connect, of longing, of something being not something like a hole in me, and feeling always perpetually restless, I said to them that if our community had a theme song, it'd be Bob Dylan's "Like a Rolling Stone." How does it feel to be on your own, a complete unknown, no direction home, like a rolling stone? And you could see people just simply stir with those. They're all like, no, and I said, yeah, that's me. That's me on the inside. And I think so. Part of the aim of the book was to sort of bring voice to that on behalf of other adoptees, and I think also shed light for others to say there's more to. We walk around, and number one, most people don't know who's adopted or not. We don't have a badge we wear around, and even when we do, we don't. The stories of how we were adopted and all that are interesting for sure, and they can capture the imagination of anybody, but they deflect from, I think, from the other issue, the psychological, how those on the insides of us, how our adoption, our separation has changed. That's true even for people like me who grew up with really great parents. I lucked out. I could not have wanted for better parents. We're very different from each other, but I was still so fortunate to have them as parents that made so much rest of my life possible. But they could no more understand that than anyone else could, except for probably somebody just like me. And I think the more people I meet who, oftentimes casually, I mean, I dare say if I'm in a group of 5 or 6 people, if I ask the question, "Have you been adopted, or are you a parent of an adoptee, or do you know somebody who's been adopted?" I usually get 2 or 3, yeses out of 5 to that question. So there are about 1.5 million of us who have been adopted formally in the United States. If you add on to that, those who have been raised by somebody other than a biological parent, that could be a grandparent, a sister, a foster parent, that number shoots to 10 million. And
Yeah.
then I've read this other place, and I don't know if we can confirm this, but if you talked about ways in which we've all been affected in our lives by others who have been adopted, or we know of people who have been adopted, that number shoots to 10 million. That's why it's pretty easy in a crowd to find somebody, and you never know. I mean, a lot of times people don't discover, their best friend was adopted until it comes up someday, and that can work the other way too. I have one story from on a podcast. I heard this story. The guy was at his 25th anniversary, and one of his classmates came over and said, I've always been wanting to ask you, like, what was it like to be adopted? And he had no clue. He was like just shocked to his core. And then she said, "Oh my God, what did I do?" And I let the cat out of the bag. But sometimes it can be that way. We
So
discover these secrets.
yes. So how normal is it in an adoptive parent situation? I mean, the way I think they look at it, like, well, this is just an infant, and so the infant's not going to know any different. Do a lot of adoptive parents hide the fact that their child is adopted, or is there a broad range of that as well?
I don't really factually. I don't know. In my case, the adoption agency where I came from insisted that they tell me and early and often. Some people have waited until their kids are grown up or until they get their teens and then drop the bomb on them and say, "Guess what? You're not really ours." So those are much more jolting. And in fact, the story that my parents told, which I think was completely true, is that you know we chose you. You're special. I mean, and they built that into the family lore, even though they later had three other children of their own, and that was still the story. And so they stuck to it. But I think that would be a piece of advice, if you will, to always tell at least kids they were adopted. Whether you get to whatever a parent may or may not know, may not be something the kid needs to know until they're older, let's say age 18, when they're more mature and can handle. Because not a lot of adoption stories or birth parent stories are very convoluted, and even though some people want to know early, and as I did, I look back and think, oh my gosh, what if I would have found out this information when I was 16? Or what if they would have? What if I came to them in their lives when I was 16 and said, "Hey, I know you're my birth parents." It would have been life changing, not especially in a good direction. It would have been very confusing to deal with. So I was happy that things rolled out the way they did in time.
Well, and I want to take everybody back because there's a large segment of our population who really doesn't know that this even existed. Because there was a time when having a baby out of wedlock was really taboo and was looked down upon terribly on the person who was pregnant. Not so much the guy, but the girl, because she had the baby and she
Right,
couldn't necessarily prove who the father was,
right, right.
and so they would send her away rather
Or
than.
that, yeah, or that the father walked away, and the birth father, is I think was my case, that he's simply out of here. That was it.
Yeah, you're pregnant. See ya. Nice. Have a nice day. Good luck. And
Of course,
but
there's no record of that, and it still begs the question, particularly back then, like, how did people communicate? By letter? There's a telephone? I mean, that wasn't very likely. I mean, today the things we accept as commonplace, cell phones, text, email. It's a lot easier to communicate secretly with that than back then. So, but yeah, again, I think there's all manner of those stories, but certainly it carried the stigma, and I don't think that stigma is as strong today. And there aren't places, like you mentioned, where I was born, a place called the Willows Maternity Sanitarium in Kansas City. Those homes for unwed mothers really don't exist the way they used to. But there was a time in the 50s, I think, and before that, where it was a big industry. And frankly, too, I don't have that data in front of me, but I think even in the 50s, as an example, abortion was way more common, I think, than it is today, at least per population. I don't know that for a fact, but that was also the other alternative, although it may be looked at more with more condemnation, but it still was quite popular, prevalent.
yeah, well, in those days, before Roe versus Wade, and it became legal, abortions were still happening. There were there
Right,
were there were people who were able to do the medical procedures. I'm not saying it was safe, and it was much more difficult, but it was still happening even way back
right,
when.
right, right. Different
And
days, different era.
yes, yes, it is, and in many ways, thank goodness that we are a lot more understanding of how pregnancy works,
Right,
and the kids that are pregnant today that don't have to go away, and
right.
they and that stigma, because I can only imagine in those days it's like, where did Mary go? I mean,
Yeah,
when the kids at school, it'd be like, well, I don't. The rumor has it, and
right.
so then when Mary would come back, eventually, it would be like, there still was a stigma attached to it, I would imagine.
Yeah, you live in a small town like my birth mother did. It's the Scarlet Letter. I mean, you are branded and probably branded for life. I think that's why sometimes people do move around, so they don't carry that, the gossip and the stigma that came from their small town. It just simply was, particularly my grew up in Iowa. My birth mother came from Iowa, and the small town, and those are pretty, you know,
Everybody knows your business.
yeah, everybody goes to church, and everybody has a pretty conventional, at least, set of moral values and so forth. So just what everybody felt and did. So, but of course, we're talking about the pre-pill days. So the pill, when it came along, it was a game changer for a lot of this too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. You were talking about that nobody really knows people that are adopted. I mean, it's not like you wear a sign on your forehead or something, but
Right, right.
when you are adopted, do you sometimes feel like there's a sign on your forehead?
No,
No? Good.
no, no. I never feel. Even growing up, I don't think it was something that was widely known. I don't think I went around telling my friends, guess what? But I didn't think it was something I was trying to hide either. So just, but even as an adult, I don't know. There's some people I don't feel so strong. There's a Facebook a page for those of us who are still alive with from the Willows Maternity Sanitarium, and for some people, their adoption was the happiest day of their lives. I mean, that was like that. They simply, well, frankly, they don't agree with some of the things I've said about carrying this internal wound that we carry with us. Whether they believe that or not, I really don't care. But for some, even suggesting somehow that there was some kind of trauma involved with the separation of mother and child, they just don't buy it, and that's fine with me because that's not their reality. But they think this was a lucky day for me, and I don't want to know. I have no interest in knowing where I came from or who I came from. My parents are the greatest people, and I totally accept that. It's just people's, that's their reality, right? So that's who am I to say that they shouldn't feel that way in that point of view. Now that said, as a psychotherapist with a Jungian and depth psychological background, our my psychotherapy orientation is much more inclusive of the idea that we do have an unconscious, and we carry a lot of our own trauma in the unconscious, and that's why early childhood trauma, either abject trauma like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or developmental trauma, which is more how we bond or don't with our parents, we carry that stuff with us, and it has ways of showing later in life that someone with my training can see the connection. For other people who may not, say, well, hey, they're an infant, what do they know? I mean, i I do have a client who's she was 4 months from being born when mother her mother tried to kill herself. So believe me, she carries that imprint. You just do, that inner knowledge of something, in our in utero experience. It still shows up in the child, and later in the adult.
That is so interesting. Now you have spent your life being going to school and learning about Jung and about many of the different concepts that are out there. And we're going to talk about that if you wouldn't mind,
Sure.
because I would really like to. We're learning more and more about the subconscious, about the soul, about the eternal part of us, and it is a different concept when you look at it in its totality rather than segmenting it out in smaller
Hmm.
portions. And
Yeah.
I think
By definition, at least in my world, my mind anyway, when we talk about, well, in psychology, sometimes we refer to the psyche. Others would say the psyche is soul. One way or the other, there's still something about when we talk about that, not necessarily in strictly religious terms, but more broadly, it's by definition ineffable. I mean, it's something you can say what it means, but we don't really know what it means, but we still know what it means. It's sort of like Stuart Potter's on the Supreme Court, what he said about pornography. I don't know what it is, but I can if I see it, I can tell you what it is. So,
I know it
so
when I see it. That's
there you
ex-
go. That was
that's
the quote.
that's
But
exact
anyway,
that's
but yeah,
exactly
but
right.
but but you have to assume that, at least in my work, out of my experience even prior to becoming a psychotherapist in later life, that you assume that something, a deeper something in us, or a higher self, beyond the how our talking self, beyond the workaday who we are, my outer identity. I'm my name, who I'm married to, where I live, what I do, who my children are, and so forth and so on. That's all real. But then we have that other deeper essence that we're, in that way, we all are all of a similar nature. We all have soul. Of course, Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, and there we're all joined in that, in a collective, in a communal sort of way with our psychic presence, with our souls.
We're going to talk about all that. We're talking with Stephen. It's Rowley, right? Rowley?
Rowley, long ago.
I have a 50% chance most of the time, and that's why I don't gamble. And so it's Rowley, and he's written the book The Lost Coin. And we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come right back. And it's 30 seconds, so don't go anywhere.
Don't worry.
Huh?
Okay. Ted Williams only bat 400, so you're doing great.
We'll be right back.
They have your eyes. They have your ears. They have your smile. Now all they need is a little more of your time. Make a difference in your child's life, because anyone can be a father. It takes time to be a dad.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. And we've got a great guest for you today. He's the author. He's written the book, The Lost Coin. If you want to go find out more about him and all of his work and all of the things that he does for you, and you can work with him one-on-one if you want to, Stephen Rowley is his name, and ROWLEY 108.com. And you can look at he's got everything that you need there. And he does one thing that I really like and I really appreciate. If you want to get The Lost Coin, go to a local bookseller, maybe a mom and pop, and they can order it for you, or something along those lines.
You're much more likely to get it online through Amazon. I don't like saying that, but it's another conversation about bookstores and the book business. But anyway, Amazon's the easiest and best way to get it.
Very, very good. Very good. So in my opening that I talk about why are we really here and what is my purpose, that at one point in our life, I think everybody comes to the conclusion that what they've seen in the five senses and what's out there isn't enough, that there has to be more than that. And be it in your subconscious, be it in your soul, be it your what you're here to do and how you're here to interact with others. There's a whole myriad of things. And was there a point in time when you decided that you wanted to go down that road and to get some education and some different things like Jung and different aspects of things? And by the way, you've got a wonderful on your website, a wonderful list of suggested books. And there's some really, really fine material there if you're interested in finding out more about who you really are and why you're really here. Was there a point in time like that for you?
About which?
About that you were going about life and you were doing what you were doing, but then it just seemed like it wasn't enough, or that you wanted to find out more and you wanted to understand more than what you had been told about things.
I guess you'd say I was just born curious. I mean, after high school, I got interested in psychology. There was not a very good time at University of Wisconsin. Got into English, so eventually went into public education. But I've changed jobs or gone to different schools. Went Wisconsin undergrad. I went here for a short time at UW. Got a teaching credential. Eventually ended up at Stanford for my PhD. And there, I really lit fire with my own learning. And since then, I guess you'd say I'm a polymath. I can't run into something I don't want to know more about it. So I've got a whole library here full of that kind of stuff. But I think that it took finally getting back in at a later age. What's been over 10 years when I decided it was time to really do what I really wanted to do from the time I was 13 years old, which is get to jump into the world of psychotherapy. And in doing so, it's also another way to get closer to my own deeper curiosity about what makes us all tick. What goes on inside of us? What makes you and me different from each other? How are we the same? and we're dealing with people who have particular problems or who are looking for different kinds of growth, that really interests me in having that kind of exchange with people. So that's led me into all number of avenues of exploration. And frankly, sometimes I think the, the more I know, of course, this is always true, the more how much I realize how much I don't know and never will. But the question of who am I was, of course, the through line of my book. And I didn't leave the question, but it changed on me as I wrote. Because to me, that question, who am I, although it's certainly an existential question, is also kind of it's a little bit of putting the carrot in front of the mule in front of the cart. You just get him walking fast enough, you think you're going to get there and learn that whatever else. And so that's led me down all number of avenues, spiritual avenues, psychological. There's quite a bit about Zen and Buddhism in my book, which I've been a part of for some time. So I ended up on a note of end of the book really kind of concludes, if you will, it's the mystery of it all becomes the more compelling part of experience that as I mentioned before, that word ineffable, how we experience the ineffable parts of this life, even though this world right now is not exactly one we want to put our arms around and give a big warm hug to. It's a really divided, pretty rotten place in time in some places. Still, there are great people doing great things and people with amazing minds and great hearts that are doing lots of stuff. So I guess I think at my age, people say, well, aren't you retired? When you're going to retire? I go, well, I'm never retiring. I'm never going to hang it up. I've got my head in 5 or 6 books. And I'm watching a couple things on TV, and I just can't absorb enough of it. There's with what time is left, I just want to keep learning and I think connecting with people in whatever ways that make it interesting.
I am wholeheartedly with you. That retirement is not of I'm just a titch younger than you, but retirement is not in the plans. I'm not going to do that because I want to continue to learn, and I learn best by talking with people like you, and you are you've done so much with with Buddhism and with Eastern philosophy, which I'm a very big fan of, as well as some Western things, and kind of melding them together and trying to really figure out, not who's right or wrong, but what are the possibilities. And I think that there are some. I know Carl Jung was one that believed in there were lots of possibilities, and
Right.
and one of which was that we're all connected, and they now have proven through science and that we all are energetic beings and we all have got a connection to one another.
Right.
And so we're finding out more and more about these things, but it really is fun. And when you're in the psychotherapy business, I imagine you can use those things to kind of help people understand why they think the way they think and how they're going. Or is that not, are we not there yet?
Oh no, that's it entirety. That includes some of the younger ones. And when we're done today, I've been seeing a 15-year-old. I just took on a 13-year-old, which is a little bit of a challenge. We're not talking high level cognitive, but you're talking about how do you get into kind of ratchet back down into the world of their language, their world, and try to use it as a time to explore it, because they've come, or their parents have sometimes brought them to me because of certain issues, and how they, like anybody else, any other adult, in their time and way, will open up if they feel security and comfort with you. And I don't get too pushy. I don't have a lot of, it's not too jargony. There's not a lot of ideas. That same is true for most adults, get turned off by a lot of jargon, with exception for those who are ready to talk about sometimes about how some of the, I'll call ancient wisdom, does apply directly to their lives. But often, usually through metaphor and story, are the ways in which I think people learn best. So I got a bunch of those up my sleeve that I often pull out.
I I gotta tell you, what's it like working with a 15-year-old? Because they live in a completely different world than the one you and I grew up in.
Well, without getting into too much detail, I can't, of course. But when you're talking, well, in a case, well, it's true for other adults too. By way of getting to know them and kind of beginning to kind of go down through the layers, like cutting through an onion, and you realize that this kid or other kids I've had this age have been to places far darker or more complicated than I've ever been. Maybe not as dark. I mean, I've been through my own stuff, but I have to have known what it's like to be alone and to be trapped the way trauma traps us. Trauma can have its grip, leaves us in a dissociated state. When you can kind of get close to that and be able to convincingly, not necessarily through words, but more through emotion and intuition, say, I know what it's like to be where you are. It's like you're holding up a lantern in a place that's very dark for them. It's as though it's really like, thank God somebody's here. Now they're not saying that in so many words, but it's sort of like, I understand what's going on with you, and without judgment and how it happened, and sometimes understand how some of the terrible things that have happened to the hands of other adults have been criminal, and being able to help them touch emotionally into the rage or sadness that rightfully belongs to them. They've also felt that they couldn't express. Oh, I can't be angry with my dad just because he beat me on Saturdays. Oh, he's my dad. So there's techniques, even Jungian techniques, of how do we let that penetrate into what I would call their emotional truth, not their story, but their truth. The great Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron has, it's on my website. It's really the key to all therapy. It's very short. Let your heart break and drop the story. Let your heart break and drop the story. So all the story stuff, all the heady stuff, all the words are one thing, but usually they obfuscate for the fact that heartbreak or some deeper emotions where you're trying to get to with most clients, depending on the situation. And frankly, some of the younger ones are a lot easier to get there than people who are 3 times their age, where it's very difficult to get into that. There's so much other bullshit, pardon me, but so much of the other story and gunk that explains and rationalizes and defends and so forth, and to kind of clear away with that and be able to go more deeply into that truth is something that some younger people are actually very well equipped to do.
We need to take a station break, but when we come back, I want to talk to you because I think this is a real key component of getting healthy and getting well, is to understand the difference between reality and the story that you tell yourself, or the stories that have been accumulating over time based upon what other people have told you your whole life that you now firmly believe, even though they're not true. We're going to take a break. We're talking with Stephen Rowley, and go to his website, StephenRowley108.com, and you'll find out all about him. We'll be back in a minute and 10. Hold on.
Okay.
You're listening to Brushwood Media Network, the best in syndicated talk, news, and entertainment shows.
As you go about your daily life, look closer. As you gather with family and friends who love and support you, look closer. There are youth right in your community who don't have the home, warmth, and healing you have. So look closer. Every year across America, a staggering 4.2 million youth are homeless or trafficked. And for 50 years, Covenant House has worked relentlessly to keep them safe and protected. Tonight, 2,000 young people will sleep safely in a Covenant House bed. And tomorrow, they will wake up surrounded by love. They get clean clothes, hot meals, medical care, and a safe place to sleep. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In sites across America to help them fulfill the great promise of their lives. So look closer at Covenant House. To help or get help, go to covenanthouse.org.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. I am so pleased to have you here, Stephen. And by the way, this broadcast is going to be heard on the Brushwood Media Network, the network that we just talked about. Oh. And I just want you to know I got my numbers and of course we are in conjunction with Apple and stuff. And I want to thank all of the listeners that are listening to Positive Talk on the Brushwood Media Network. And they number in the, ready for it, Stephen? Ready? Hundreds of thousands, maybe even as many as 1 million. So we're looking, and I want to thank every one of you. And I hope you're appreciating this presentation, because Stephen is a very learned man. He's spent his whole life from being adopted to learning how that affected him and others like him. And it really is an important topic that I think is underserved in many ways. And one of the things that we had just touched on is the stories that people have told us, the stories that we have in our head that we think are true, but oftentimes are not. And how do you help people break through those stories and to recognize that maybe they're not as true as we thought they were?
Well, sometimes we do get those big surprises when something we thought wasn't true is, or it's a different interpretation of things, or someone new shows up that you had no clue about, and they turned out to be somebody who was of great significance to you. Uh, Maybe just a variation of this is, I think, what's more common is that, particularly around parents, and this also can do with maybe other loved ones or spouses or even children, is that people are carrying around two different versions of what we might say is the same story. For example, somebody will come and it'll come up in some way or another. Sometimes people come and say they're coming to me because of depression or conflict or anxiety or whatever. And as we begin digging back in the past, uh, somebody will say, "Well, my old man was just a rotten SOB, and he used to beat me and my brothers and sisters, and the terrible things he did to my mother. I hate his guts. I hope he just rots in hell." And then they'll turn around and go, but on the other hand, he wasn't such a bad guy after all. He still came to my ball games and so forth. And so what I think is more the case is that by the time you begin to explore how people's stories around their interpretation of events is that, or the school that they went to, or the cops that did them wrong, or your old girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever. The tendency is to choose one story over the other. So let's call that the common reality. Okay, he was a rotten SOB, and I'm not changing my story. That's the way he was. Failing to recognize that they're also carrying around this other part that was the other part of who this father was. Now, maybe in a case that I've just given, maybe 9 times out of 10, we'd of course come down to the fact that he wasn't a very good guy. But it dismisses the idea they did have something else going. There was a relationship. There was something else there. And so, in working with clients, this is an old Jungian trick, what we call attention to the opposites. I try to bring both stories out, both versions of dad out, not to change their minds, but to say one side or the other is no doubt why you're still dragging the other part behind you, even unconsciously, giving this kind of feeling like something's not quite right. So what I've done then is it's basically almost a spiritual challenge, is cultivate the patience for the foreseeable future to say both of these are true, and to learn how to hold both those as true. They're contradictory in nature, and then I'll say let this percolate for a while. It may be a week, it may be a month, it may be a year. We don't know, but at some point, the resolution to those opposites will emerge. It's kind of like a dialectic. So this was where a new kind of story, let's call it even a new reality, that emerges. For example, another example: people who were failed from the time they're in first grade, and they have nothing but an inferiority complex, and all they want to do is blame the school for how messed up they are. And some people can live their life as being, as playing victim. That's their story. They're not going to change it. It wasn't for my mother. It's usually a parent. It wasn't for the old man. It wasn't for my mom. If it wasn't for the principal of the school, I'd be really different. So that blame game is something they carry around like a huge weight on their shoulders, never quite knowing why they still feel as bad as they do, but not willing to give up the story. And so part of that is like, let's either give up the story or change the story, give it a new title. Maybe there was something else. This is part of why I think things like depression, for example, bear more time going into say, you may be really completely depressed, but is there something in the middle of your depression that actually is a hidden gift for you? If your old man was so bad, and treated you so terribly, what might be the benefit to you in the long run? What can you pull out of that that has made you what you are today on a positive side? Now, those are challenging ideas, but you're tweaking the story, you're tweaking the interpretation and meaning that we've picked up over time. But we're all in this way that we entertain the slippery slope of the Rashomon story from the Japanese, the Seven Samurai. They all see a rape committed on the other side of the river, and each one of the samurai has a different story. What do they see? What happened? Are they all lying? Are they all telling the truth? Or who's telling? What's the reality of it? Of course, that introduces the idea that there are multiple perspectives in lives, and they're changeable. We can change the sort of banner headline, if you will. I once was in a workshop. This is kind of graphic. We were asked in a pair to each of us tell us our worst victim story. This is in Seattle years ago, and my partner and I did, and we thought our stories were pretty horrible and how we were getting screwed over by this thing or that. And the leaders chose a woman who got up, and her story that she told in front of the group was gripping. How the proverbial rapist with a knife crept in her room, her baby's in a little basket next to the bed, puts the knife up to her and says, "Either you give yourself to me or I'm going to slit your throat." And so she let him do what he needed to do. And it went on all night. I mean, it's a tear-jerking, heart-wrenching. I mean, the whole place is in just complete tears. That's a touching story. And you think, well, what are you going to do with that? I mean, you can't change that story. And then, so he waited until she got composed, and we all did. And she said, "Now I want you to tell the group again this other story. I want you to tell this story with the new title, How I Saved My Baby's Life." Whoa. You see that sacrifice. The sacrifice allowing this to happen to her in order to save the child next to her. Total night and day difference. It didn't change the event, but it changes the meaning of the story. It changed the perspective. And so I think that's the, kind of this framing that we do in our lives. And I think if we're, just as we look at our lives, as we told her, if we looked every decade, how we would tell the story of our lives, they'd be different. And frankly, we could do that every day. If I talked to you tomorrow and you'd say, "Give me 5 minutes, the story of your life," it'd be different. It'd be different the day after that.
Exactly. But by the way, since you're a professional and I have you, and we're going to be talking for the next 15 minutes or so, I can get your professional advice for free.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you how prevalent this is, because I have a family member that when she was a little girl, she distinctly remembers that her mom and dad, my mom and dad, separated for a period of time. And she distinctly remembers going to the door as my dad was driving away and crying because dad was going away. And then for the entirety of her life, she wanted to please him. And she wanted to be his little girl. But he never was very warm and kind to her throughout her life. So she made life decisions based upon trying to please someone who was not capable of that. And so it affected her entire life. Does that happen a lot?
In a more broad way, it definitely does. There's a book by James Hollis calling it "Dispelling the Ghosts Who Run Our Lives." We have parents in particular, we call them complexes sometimes, parent complexes. Even when the parents are dead and gone, they're still, you're still trying to, bat home runs for dad, or you're trying to make enough money that mom would really be pleased with you. And we're doing that unconsciously most of the time. And what we fail to recognize, and that's what therapy helps do, is that you're probably, she probably paid a very dear price the rest of her life for holding on to that. It's not to take away. In fact, it's almost leaning into that heartbreak, as I mentioned before, that heartache of losing a parent. Divorce is enormously traumatic for kids, and I dare say, oftentimes that imprint never really goes away. Now, it doesn't have to be like 100-pound weight on your shoulders, but the memory of it, or the images you have attached with it, sometimes stay, and some are you can't erase. And so, as I said before, maybe there is something else about the image of her crying with him going away. It would take some time working with her or somebody else in a similar situation to the value and the power of that particular image is what we Jungians and those who followed James Hollis, who succeeded Jung, that image is everything. So the image and the feeling, more than the story, are so important. And for somebody who's experienced that, to really validate that it's no wonder. I mean, who wouldn't have that as a lasting memory? So that begins to bring up the issue of what other legacy is left behind that's hidden. It's like, where's Waldo? In the picture, there's some little clue. There's something else from the past, or something we can't quite see yet that actually offers a gift to us that we had not expected to find. And for that reason, even the people who leave us and break our hearts, we often, with enough work, can go back and realize. For some people who were growing up with really mean parents, realize that they actually that made them into really sensitive people, or if you had a horrible parent, made them into great parents. I mean, what a gift! It doesn't seem so at the time. You don't go, oh yeah, give me another, hit me again, Dad. I'm going to be a great parent. That doesn't happen. That's not going to happen. But later, now of course that can go the other way. Then we can learn from Dad and learn to be an abuser ourselves. But we can be sensitized to how we will become determined not to repeat the sins of the past. That's what I call kind of cauterizing the generational trauma. And every now and then I'll get a client who understands, if I can get this right, then I'm going to have stopped all the stuff that came from both sides of the family, and I'm stopping it here now in my tracks. We're ending this stream of generational trauma. And some people do that. That's one hell of a job to take that on, but that's how powerful. And when they can feel those ancestors, both living and dead, who are wanting for something better. I mean, even the people who are the abusers have, they're trapped in something themselves too. We can at least act in good faith to alleviate that further injustice and pain and torment to others. And it's a noble inner calling, I think.
I've got to take one more break and then we're done. But I would really like for you to talk about what I call the 7-generation cycle, and how it affects generations upon generations and how to break that. And we'll be right back. You're listening to Positive Talk.
A lifetime of savings can disappear overnight. Millions of dollars are stolen every day from unsuspecting older adults by family members, caregivers, and trusted professionals. If you suspect financial exploitation, call the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116 or go online to the National Adult Protective Services Association to be connected with help in your area.
And welcome back, everybody. We're talking with Stephen Rowley. He's written the book, The Lost Coin. It's about his walk through life from adoption on forward. And he was even a college radical in the 70s. I don't even know if anybody knows what that means exactly, but he's a psychotherapist. He has done some wonderful work. And one of the things that he had just mentioned, and I wanted to bring it up again because I think it is so important, that we, as all of us sitting here in the place that we all have the ability to end our family's 7-generation cycle, is what I call it, which means that if your dad was an abuser, your grandfather was an abuser, then your dad was an abuser, and then you become an abuser, and it can go generation after generation because that's what they know. Am I correct in that? Is that what you would term that?
In the break there, you had me scrambling on my AI chatbot to go back and put in 7-generational cycle, because I've never really referred to that term. So it's like it's an interesting but the notion that the cycling down of what happens, and that can be for both the good and ill. You think of multiple generations of slave owners, as an example, or multiple. You could just go on, both good and bad. The things can run in families, and for good or as though we're governed by DNA when it's not. It's almost epigenetic. So those things run through us. Those things, alcoholism, as an example, there's not an alcohol gene, but some families are rife with it, and do a lot of damage on account of that. So it exists, and
I got a question for you. Speaking of alcoholism, what is the difference, and why is there a difference between somebody who can have a beer and go home, or somebody can have 3 or 4 beers and go home? And then there are people who have a beer and they can't stop until they fall down and are passed out. What is the difference? Is that physical? Is that psycho? I don't even know how that works.
Well, I had a client for some time who was been in AA for 40 years and supervised a lot of people and does a lot of talking over here on this side of the water and over in Seattle. And so, frankly, I've had those same conversations with her. Is this, I can trace in her life, and for me, when she started drinking at age 12, and why she started drinking because of a narcissistic mother. But a lot of other people could have the same situation and not drink. I think it's a little parallel to trauma itself. Why do some people, let's say people who are in war, who experience almost identical experiences, some can kind of absorb it, even if they've seen friends killed in battle, more or less metabolize it, come back and begin to lead an ordinary life. And how come others come back, are plagued with depression, alcoholism, domestic abuse, and sometimes suicide. Why we're built the way we are, and how it's, as I've heard say, it's not the trauma, it's the response to trauma. Why do we? So if Carl Jung was one of the founders of AA. He and Bill A. Collaborated through correspondence for some time. I think they met in person, and that was where the idea of a surrender to a higher nature, God or whatever, to a higher power, to be finally in control of our habits. But why it sticks with some people and others, I don't think anybody really knows. I don't think there's at least I don't have the answer for that. So, but I suspect that in many cases, if not most, there's trauma is lurking under the hood.
I wouldn't disagree with that at all. What do you what about another situation where you have, as an example, 3 kids, and the parents look relatively like each other, or okay, 2 of the kids look exactly like your dad, and the other one looks exactly like your mom, but there is no crossover, but there is with the other kids, and then they start talking about maybe sex out of wedlock and all those stories that go under. That happens a lot too in families, doesn't it?
Probably does, yeah. That's the remember the milkman? What did he look like?
Exactly, or the guy that he looks just like him. I remember that guy, and so it's we live.
I've got a story at the tip of my tongue that came from a client. It was like this. That I don't think I'm going to be able to pull it up, but it was that somewhere down the line that it was revealed that I'm your mother, but he's not your father. That kind of thing. It was with somebody else. I can't remember. I wish I could pull that story up, but I can't. But anyway,
well, it's in my case, and I can say this now because everybody's passed, but there was a rumor going around because my parents in the olden days, people did not get divorced. He was Catholic, his parents were Catholic, they didn't get divorced. And if the marriage wasn't good because you got married at 19 or 20 and 21, which is when they did, well, you just had to live with it. And then he had a couple of kids, and then you had to live with that and stuff. But there was a point in time when they broke up for 4 years, 3.5 years. Well, my older brother was born 18 months before me, and he looked different than than my sister who was older, or me who was younger. So there was always looking out of the corner of your eye. Are you? And he behaved very differently. Are you really related to us or not? Kind of thing. So that those things happen.
We're not as nearly as conventional as somehow some ways we think we all are or should be. I mean, in terms of, of course, we know the nuclear family is kind of a thing of the past, but in so many other ways, it's just, there's sometimes I'm amazed thinking, if we're people who had significant trauma when they were young or came from a broken home or whatever, and were painted a certain color, we'd be shocked. We'd be shocked by how many people who carry this stuff around their past, whether they were old enough to remember it or not is almost aside from the question that we have. And it makes us do some pretty crazy things, or think seemingly, or we subject our children to things that maybe you're going with it. But I mean, places where there's a lot of drinking and violence and guns and drugs and, half sisters and ex-boyfriends. And I've got a couple clients out like that. To me, it's like, God, I'd be off the rails. How did, I see there, I have to give my one client like a lot of credit just for being able to survive that stuff. But it's not my world. I mean, by comparison, for a white, affluent, middle class person, it's like, I still, I'm sure I'm not shocked much by stories anymore. But it defies what the sense of normal is. There isn't any real normal to much of any of us.
I'm convinced that as long as I've been on the planet, that as far as families goes, there is no such thing as the Leave It to Beaver kind of family that everybody gets along and they don't have any dysfunction. I think to some degree every family is dysfunctional. What do you think?
Well, I think that's what Eugene O'Neill said. I think that we're all families are just dysfunctional. They're just dysfunctional in different ways.
Exactly. It just depends. We're going to run out of Stephen. We're going to run out of time, so I want to make sure we get the word out and to talk about your website again and the book, The Lost Coin. Get it through Amazon. It's a memoir of adoption and destiny by Stephen Rowley, PhD, and his website is Stephen Rowley, Rowley 108.com. Go there. You can learn all about him. You can actually even work with him, and you can drop him a line and see if you mesh. I firmly believe that everybody needs. Everybody's a little crazy, if you know what I mean. I think everybody needs some help from time to time, and
thank God.
Yeah, exactly. Before we go, we're going to run out of time, but I want to give you a moment to tell our audience anything that you would like them to know.
I was just going to say this, and we're talking about trauma and screwed up lives and generational trauma, and I think it belies the fact of our own inner capacity for love and trust, and it's not something if we're lucky, we're born into circumstances where we learn how to be that way, but other people overcome that and learn how to be loving and trustful by whatever means. I mean, I think I'd leave that with the thing about we all have that capacity in us. As Leonard Cohen said in his anthem, "Ring the bells that still will ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's what lets the light in." It's like the crazy part. So forget your offering. Don't have to be perfect. You can't be perfect. Do what you have to do, but there's a crack in all of us. We all have something that is a fissure in us that seems as though makes us feel at moments damaged, broken, incomplete, whatever. But if we don't realize that crack lets the light in, then we've missed something. We've missed something along the way. Or as Joseph Campbell said, where we stumble is where we find the gold. So our problems become our Dalai Lama's very words. It's our problems and our obstacles that become our greatest teachers. Without that, or without failure, how do we learn? So that's that kind of embracing all these troubles we're talking about as essentially the essence of being human, and as I say, hearkening back to a reminder that we're not fated to live in misery. We actually have that capacity to lead full lives and happier lives, for sure.
And if you believe like I do, and I don't know if maybe I need to be on medication, but I think all of life's experiences are for my upper good, and I learn something from them so that I can become the human being that I have always desired to be. And you can't learn that without some degree of problems along the way in order for you to become your best self. So at least that's my idea.
That's what my book's about too. There's plenty of those problems and weird things along the way, as you know. So
exactly, I call it my bad country music song period. But we'll tell that story another time. I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for being here. Stephen Rowley, get his book, The Lost Coin. Go to his website, StephenRowley108.com. I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to have you back There is so much more to talk about. So
Yeah, have me back.
Yes.
Just across the water.
yeah, yeah. Maybe we'll do it from your balcony. That would be fun. So
Okay.
thank you again, sir. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. We are a production of KMmedia.pro, a full-service media company. Whether it is audio, video, shorts, or longer pieces, we're able to take each project from beginning to final product within your time frame and on budget. Visit KMmedia.pro for more details about us and to get started on your project. We also would like to thank the Brushwood Media Network for all their support. Go to brushwoodmedianetwork.com to find out more about them and the quality shows featured on the network. Until then, we'll see you next time. My name again is Kevin McDonald, and please remember, be kind to one another because each other's all we've got.